The Austro-Hungarians attacked tiny Serbia. Russia came to its defense. Germany was in a treaty with Austria-Hungary and had to attack Russia. France had to attack Germany as she was allied to Russia, as was Great Britain. To reach Paris, the German army had to run through neutral Belgium. And to defend tiny Belgium, France and Britain had to rush troops to the fields of Flanders. Britain had only 2 army corps immediately at the start of war against Germany's 26 regular and 19 reserve corps. So on 6th of August 1914, at a meeting in Downing Street, it was decided that Britain had to involve its Indian army. The regular Indian army at that time was about 160,000 strong and well trained as per colonial needs and standards. By September 1914, the 2 divisions of Meerut and Lahore were on their way to the Western Front, where the French, British and Belgian forces were finding it hard to contain the Germans.
The artillery was one of the main developments of the Great War and a strongly overseen development. Initially there was a lack of everything, and especially of artillery and shells. That problem was solved in 1915-16, and from then on the artillery became the main weapon. It's often said that by 1916-17 the war was fought by the artillery and exploited by the infantry. There was a huge increase in artillery, which then destroyed also everything.
The First World War changed the way war was fought, and the cost in human lives has been terrible. It had been terrible. There were thousands and millions of people who died because new ways of waging war, new machines had come to play. And so high was the cost that even today, 100 years later, on an average, in the fields of Flanders alone, around 10 dead bodies are found of soldiers who had died fighting during the First World War. The city of Ypres, or Ypres as it is locally pronounced in Flemish, was the scene of battle for the entire length of the Great War. The city served as the symbol of Allied resistance against the Axis powers. The city was completely demolished, and all around this region of Flanders stretched the trenches. Miles upon miles of dugouts and shallow canals where men lived, fought and died. Hundreds and thousands of deaths marked by the cemeteries that dot the region. Every nationality and region that sent soldiers to fight in Flanders find mention in the gravestones that stand mute reminders of the horror that visited this land. Tucked in corners of such cemeteries in France and Belgium can be seen the names of those Indians who never came back. It was a war that India had no direct stake in, and the reasons and conditions remained far removed from the average Indian soldier. They went to fight for their personal honor and for the honor of their regiments.
Heidenen Indiaanse troepen zijn ook op de Prochie, meest langs de kant van Vlamertingen.
So distant were the culture and society of the land where the Indians fought, that curious locals visited the Indian camps to see for themselves these people from far away.
Zwart van vellen, gekleed als Engelse soldaten uit.
Except for their head, which is skillfully wrapped in a turban. They speak English, and some also speak French.
They would have learned about Africans and Indians in school, but they would have never laid eyes upon an Indian person before. So they were extremely curious. And from the accounts we have, like the one of Father Van Wallegem, you can read that they are curious and that they want to engage with these Indian troops. So we do have quite a number of accounts where you see that there were commercial or even friendly engagements. We know that, for instance, from this citation from the priest, that he has even tasted the Indian food.
In October 1914, the Indian troops were fed piecemeal into some of the fiercest fighting around Ypres. The losses were very heavy and kept mounting. By the beginning of 1915, the opposing armies along the Western Front, in a line that ran through Belgium and France, had dug themselves into trenches. And it was into these trenches that the Indians got deployed. Mulkraj Anand, in his book Across the Black Waters, describes the fictitious sepoy Lal Singh and the 69th Rifles being deployed at Ypres. They were told to keep their backs bent and their heads straightened up. And around them they could see a British soldier firing at an unseen enemy. And there were bombs falling, there was confusion, there was sound all around. He goes on to write that, but neither the earth, nor the sky, nor the air seemed any different after the thunder had died down. Actually, this was a very real description of Ypres in late October 1914, when the British sent in Indian soldiers into the trenches to fight for the first time. The Indian forces were not used as entire formations, but went in as gap fillers. Wherever a French or English line faltered, in went the Indians. When on April 22nd, 1915, Germany used poison gas for the first time, it was along a 4-mile front against the French troops. This was what came to be known as the Second Battle of Ypres. The two French divisions were decimated and the line was breached.
Troops were not protected, although there had been warnings that gas attacks might come. The mainly French troops were not protected, they didn't have gas masks, so they immediately, they tried to fight, but then they died or they ran away, and a large gap occurred on the northeast part of the front, in which then in the next days, British, Canadian and Indian troops were rushed in order to stop the German advance, but quite some ground was lost there.
Military doctor from Canada, John McRae, was amongst the first to treat the casualties of the chemical attack of 22nd April 1915. Deeply affected, he wrote the poignant verses that would forever be associated with the deathly fields of Flanders.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below.
On the wall above his bed hung up were his medals for him to see. He can't see them today, for now he is unconscious. Before he got as bad as this, he could see them, and they made him cry. He knew that he had been decorated in extremis because he was going to die.
No one expected the First World War to drag on for 4 long years. It was initially thought that the war would end in months. When it didn't, and the opposing sides dug themselves into trenches along the Western Front, hardly any gains, any territorial gains, resulted from attacks and counterattacks. And it cost lives in their thousands. Every one of the major powers began to invent newer and deadlier means to gain advantage. Poison gas to tanks, to machine guns and aeroplanes and flamethrowers. But the biggest development was probably in how artillery was enhanced and improved upon. Germany had the first mover's advantage, as when they went into war, they had some of the biggest artillery guns known to man. an advantage that saw them run through Belgian defences in the first few weeks of the war.
This is fort number 4 of the defence outside Antwerp. There were 8 such forts, each fort at a distance of 4 kilometers from the other fort. They had cannons with a range of 12 kilometers that could fire 12 kilometers. The Germans came from that side and they had cannons which could fire 18 kilometers and 20 kilometers. So they stood outside the range of these cannons and they bombed these forts. This particular fort wasn't destroyed, but the forts to the south were destroyed, and the Germans could easily move in to capture Antwerp. And that is the difference between the Allied forces and the German forces at the beginning of the First World War. Germany was technologically much better prepared, while the Allies were still fighting a 19th century war.
On 23rd October 1914, the 129 Baluchis and the 9th Bhopal Regiment arrived at Ypres. And on 31st October, the Baluchis went into action near Hollebeke. The fighting was fierce and the losses were devastating. Entire units got wiped out as men fell in battle. Khudadad Khan was the sole survivor of his unit and kept firing his machine gun in spite of grievous injuries. When the Germans finally swamped his line, he pretended to be dead after having put his machine gun out of order. Then he crawled through the German lines and made it back to the Indian ones. Khudadad Khan of the 129th Baluch Regiment was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest British military decoration, the first Indian ever to have won the most prestigious battlefield honour. Indian soldiers in the First World War went on to win 13,000 gallantry medals. By the end of the war, official records put 47,746 Indians as dead or missing, and 65,126 more as wounded.
Propaganda is such a major thing during wars. When Britain started bringing in their colonial troops, the press in Germany went wild. They showed how Britain was using troops from Australia, from Canada, from India as cannon fodder. The British press, on the other hand, showed how these troops rose to the occasion to serve in the cause of King Emperor and Britain.
By 1914, even before the war broke out, Germany had lost in its bid to become a great naval power. Britain controlled the seas, and with Britain bringing in their colonial armies from Canada, Australia, New Zealand and India, Germany needed its friend Turkey to attack Egypt and block the Suez Canal to cut Britain's shortest route to India, because that would impact Britain's ability to bring in troops and supplies from its crown colony.
What happened to the Indian army after it got pulled out of the Western Front? Taken out of the wet and cold trenches where fighting could last years, but actual ground positions barely changed. Well, they were sent to warmer climates closer to home.
The 89th Punjabis had the distinction of serving in more theatres of war than perhaps any other single battalion during the First World War. The 89th Punjabis sailed from India in November 1914 and it returned home only in September 1920. At Gallipoli, the Indian contingent was but a minuscule of the total troops deployed, but they emerged from battle with glory written all over. There were a total of 4,130 Indian casualties during the campaign, with about 1,500 of them being fatal.
Nearly 700,000 Indians fought in the Middle Eastern sector, fighting the Turks in the Mesopotamian campaign. They were involved in the Gallipoli Peninsula, they were involved in West Africa, in East Africa, and even in China. And that's no mean participation, considering the fact that it was someone else's war after all. It was someone else's quarrel.
Several Indian Army units, including Imperial Service and volunteer units, had been in East Africa since September 1914, when Indian Expeditionary Force C was sent there. Many more arrived 2 months later and did not fare well. But then, from March 1916 onwards, they proved their worth till the end of war came to Africa, a full 2 weeks after it ended in Europe. From late 1914 until mid-1915, the British forces stood on the defensive along the Suez Canal, defeating various Turkish and German attempts to capture or damage the canal. But it was not until early 1917 that sufficient force had been gathered and lines of communication established for an assault on the large Turkish forces in Palestine. And in October 1917, the Indian Army was at the forefront of the capture of Gaza and then Jerusalem, before moving on to Jordan and Syria.
If 50,000 soldiers died in a war and 65,000 of them were injured, how come so little is known about them? How come there is no folklore that exists? How come, or why is it that practically no one in India can name one hero of the Great War of 1914-1918 when the Indian soldiers fought in the First World War?
Apart from the 1,440,437 men recruited and the 1,381,050 men sent for services overseas, India also bore the cost of these troops, which were being largely used for imperial rather than Indian purposes. In 1917, India made an outright gift of £100 million towards the cost of the war. In every war, the civilian population faces many atrocities, and the German army of 1914 had never been able to live down the atrocity it committed in Leuven, Belgium, when it burned down the 500-year-old university library. At that time, considered one of the most important libraries extant in Europe.
300,000 books in this library, which dated back to the 15th century. They were burned to the ground, and all of Europe was angry. So after the war, they made Germany pay 1.3 million gold marks as compensation, and they made a list of all the books that were there when the library was burnt down, and if any of those books existed in Germany, Germany had to give it. And that's what they did.
Not only did Germany do that, but German academics and intelligentsia donated more than there ever were before. The library was rebuilt with American money and aid, except for one contribution that came from another university.
Mysore Government University. They also sent aid so that this university could be rebuilt again.
At the end of the Great War, the tally of human lives lost was staggering. 16 million dead and 20 million wounded. What had started out as an European conflict had bled nationalities from across the world. Among them, more than 100,000 casualties, dead and injured, were from India alone. Numerous monuments in Belgium, France and England stand lasting testaments to their memory. One of the central memorials for Indian soldiers is also the India Gate in New Delhi, where listed on the walls are the names of those who fell in battle. In Britain, yearly commemorations take place at the Chhatri Memorial on the South Downs in southern England, erected on the place where Sikh and Hindu soldiers who had died in hospitals on Britain's southern coast were cremated. Muslim soldiers were buried near the Shah Jahan Mosque in Woking at a special burial ground.
This eternal flame here in Belgium, in Brussels, burns in memory of those soldiers who gave their lives in defense of their country during the First World War. Across Belgium, there are many such memorials. Some of them are dedicated to the Indian soldier.
To mark the sacrifice of the Indian soldiers, the Belgians erected a memorial at the Menin Gate in Ypres, the town central to the Flanders battlefield. This was the gate through which Indian soldiers marched into battle after the long train ride from Marseille in France between 1914 and 1915. Since 11th of November 1929, a last post has played at 8 p.m. every evening at the Menin Gate in memory of those who fell in battle. The only exception to this was during the 4 years of the German occupation of Ypres from 20th May 1940 to 6 September 1944. The daily ceremony was instead continued in England at Brookwood Military Cemetery, Surrey. On the very evening that Polish forces liberated Menin Gate, the ceremony was resumed, in spite of the heavy fighting still going on in other parts of the town.
We will remember them.
Forever etched on the walls of Menin Gate are the names of Indians who never came home, as can be found on the gravestones that dot the countryside of northern France and Flanders in Belgium.
We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved.